this all right for you guys, or is this loud? Awesome. Okay, well, thank you everyone for coming along tonight, and welcome to all of our friends joining us online. It's great to see that we've got a nice intimate little group for discussion today. Also a welcome to our fabulous speakers, Chris and Michelle, and I'll give them a full introduction shortly, but I'm sure a few of you have met them before. So I'd like to begin tonight by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands on which we gather, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. It's particularly important that we keep this acknowledgement in mind given our topic of discussion tonight on advocacy, policy and government relations. In all of these areas, it's so important to leave a space for Indigenous people to have a voice in their own advocacy. You know, are we supporting them to advocate for themselves? Do our policies consider Indigenous perspectives? And learn from the wealth of knowledge and culture that we have in this country to inform our aid and development practice. So in giving thanks to that knowledge, I would like to pay our respects to the elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us today. So a little bit on Women in Aid and Development. We are a membership organisation for all women who work in or aspire to work in the international development and humanitarian aid sectors, inclusive of trans women and non-binary people. We're part of a global community of women in aid, and we'd love for you to join us in celebrating women across the sector, sharing our experiences and supporting and inspiring each other, whoops, tilted that way, to pursue and succeed in leadership roles today and in the future. You can connect with us and other fantastic women in the sector by engaging with our Facebook and LinkedIn pages. And if you're particularly inspired by anything you hear tonight or learn or anyone you meet, feel free to tag us on social media because we'd love to hear what you thought. My name's Jamie Lee McLaughlin, my pronouns are she, her, and I'll be facilitating this evening's session. I'm a recent entrant into the humanitarian sector, and I'm currently working with the Australian Red Cross, with a background in higher education and government. I'm also a member of the Women in Aid and Development Events Committee, which meets regularly to discuss ideas for these events, organise them and find speakers. I'd also like to acknowledge my fellow Women in Aid and Development people, including our fabulous volunteer teams, our board members, and of course, our Sydney event leader, Michelle, and our wonderful chair, Chris, who I'm very excited to hear from tonight. So just some quick housekeeping before we begin for the in-person people. Our bathroom is just located around the corner over there, and emergency exit is the door you came in through. Please help yourself to all of the food and drink that we have available. There's always leftovers, so please take as much as you can and hang around after our speakers to talk to them and continue networking with everybody else here. And we'd love to chat to you online as well. And our session tonight is being recorded, so we will be able to share that with you afterwards if you want to look back on what was said or share it with other people you know. So, on to our topic. Advocacy, policy and government relations. These three elements are fairly critical to a lot of the work being done in the aid and development sector, as I'm sure most of you know, and many roles are going to require skills in these areas, whether that be through influencing policy, working effectively with government, or ensuring that your organisation has a voice in critical debates. It can be a bit daunting to try and conquer these broad areas alone, so tonight we'll be hearing from the wealth of experience and advice of our two lovely speakers and their career journey in these areas. We'll then have time for questions at the end. So I'll be guiding the discussion, but most of the questions will come from you in person or our lovely friends online. So while you're listening, just make a mental note of anything you'd like to ask about. So I'll finally get on to introducing our speakers for this evening. Our first speaker is the wonderful Chris Franks. Chris has been a volunteer in the international development sector for 35 years. She's Chair of Women in Aid and Development, Director of Gateway Bank, Director of the Self-Managed Superannuation Association, and Convener of the NFP Chairs Circle. She has been Director and Chair of a number of NGOs, including Results Australia, Habitat for Humanity Australia, as well as government and other corporate organisations. Got to stop moving this, my goodness. Chris was the recipient of the inaugural Australian Council for International Development Award for Outstanding Service to the Aid and Development Sector, and in 2020 was awarded the Member of the Order of Australia for her significant service to the community through social welfare initiatives. So thank you, Chris. And our second lovely speaker for the night is Dr. Michelle Emerson. So Michelle is an international development consultant whose area of special interest include public health, gender, research, and advocacy. She's previously worked in TB advocacy, both domestically for Results Australia and globally with the Stop TB Partnership in Geneva, Switzerland, as well as in academia and government. Michelle's a co-convener in the Bangladesh Working Group in the Cross-Sector Development Partnerships Initiative, the Sydney City Leader, outgoing, sadly, for Women in Aid and Development, and co-leads a professional networking group for development consultants based in Sydney. She's previously served on the board of Oxfam Australia and as a grant maker for Graduate Women International, a women's education organisation. So thank you, Michelle. So to kick off tonight, now that we've heard all of the wonderful things that you two have done, could you give us a bit more of a summary about what you've done, introduce yourselves, and how you're feeling about the topic? If we wanted to bounce to you, Chris, to start us.
Sorry, sure. I have a big background, but my background around in the international aid space is as a volunteer, as Jamie Lee said. I'm an enthusiastic amateur, a very strong supporter, and my involvement in advocacy and policy came through as a chair of results. Now, I'm past chair of results, but we have a current chair of results here too in Tarina, who's going to correct everything I say wrong later on. But I've been on boards for a very long time, and as a director, you have a skill, which is governance, you know, lots about policies and constitutions, you know, a lot about how to run the nuts and bolts of an organisation, but you don't always get to understand, well, you do ultimately get to understand the actual business. And so every time you join a new board, it's a learning experience. So for me, I joined the board of results because at that time, it was a very, very small organisation that had just moved from being a volunteer organisation into receiving a big grant and being able to employ people. So it needed those nuts and bolts of an organisation: policies, procedures, people management, finding a DGR, registration, all of those things that make an organisation work and allow an organisation to have the structure to actually implement programs. Now, their work is in advocating to government for an increase in funding to go into global health programs. That's their raison d'etre. Michelle worked at Results while I was there, and she's the expert on how you know, all of the TB, the polio, the HIV/AIDS, all of those things that we advocated on. So I worked on the grassroots side. So you may be a chair and have a lofty title, but when you go into this stuff, you start at the ground and you have to learn every single bit. So for me, I'd never actually done advocacy of that type before. I'd done advocacy when I was chair of the ACFID Code of Conduct, go and give ministers a big pain in the neck if they weren't doing things right. But that's very different from being an everyday person living in an electorate and being the sort of person who will write a letter to an MP and go and visit an MP. And that's what the grassroots of advocacy is. For me, I had a background in, I started life as a nurse. So I knew about the medical side of stuff, and I've always been interested in that, which is why polio and all of those other things really struck a chord with me and why I was therefore interested in results. I had to learn a lot about those things in more depth than I'd ever done so that I could explain them when I went to meet an MP. And the basic grassroots side of advocacy is that when you talk to an MP in your electorate, they've got to talk to you. They want your vote. And so they're not going to say, no, go away. You will get an answer to your email or your letter, and you will get a meeting with them. And what Results did was teach me how to do that. So they showed me how to put a piece of advocacy together. How do you write the letter? What do you put in it? Because the aim of talking to the MP is that they then go and advocate and talk to the minister. And if enough MPs go and talk to a minister, they'll go, oh, maybe we should look at this and maybe we should put it on the agenda. And if you can get that happening, it really works well. So not only do you do it in your own electorate, and I went and within a couple of meetings made a relationship with my MP. He knew who I was. He made sure that he was there. I didn't just have to talk to his advisor, which, you know, is not a bad thing. It's a good first place. But I would get to see him. He would actually listen to me. He also knew that I would give him a one-page that made sense, was very simple, and I wouldn't go over my allotted 20 minutes, half an hour, because that's really all you can hope for. However, he was someone who would then write to me and say, oh, this is happening. What's your opinion on it? And I'd immediately go to Michelle and go, what's my opinion, please? That's the beauty of coming from an organisation where there are people who really know this stuff inside out. The other thing was, as a grassroots person, I was terrified having to go and talk to an MP. And every volunteer that I met after I'd done it were also terrified. And my biggest job was persuading people that it's okay. You can shake and you can have a shaky voice and they will still listen to you and take you seriously. And the beauty of results was I'd have somebody there who was a policy person, who if I couldn't get my message out, they could back me up. And it's interesting to be in a meeting where you're communicating something and you're not the expert. The person next to you is the expert, but you've got the avenue to talk to the MP. They don't care about the expert. They're a ten a penny. Sorry, Michelle. But they're not the constituent. If you're the constituent, you will put an X in the box next to their name. So you have power. And that's something that Results does. It works with individuals and it shows them how they have power. And the other thing that they do is they go along to Parliament House once a year and they have a big onslaught, go around to as many MP offices as possible. And there's usually 2 or 3 people. Ideally, there's one of the people from one of the electorates, again, with a policy expert and maybe one other volunteer who's just learning how to do it and watching what you do. So for me, it was a fantastic experience. I really learned a lot. I have to say that having chair under your name does help sometimes in getting meetings. So as a chair, you're quite often a tool as well for policy people to come to you and go, I can't get in, can you write a letter or can you make a call? And so it's always really important within an organisation to, you know, use the tools you've got. And the other thing, the last thing I'll say is something that's completely gone out of my mind. Advocacy. It'll come back in a minute. So I'll hand over to Michelle.
Well, I did have a question pop into my brain of, so that was awesome to hear that you developed those, you know, advocacy skills about even writing the letters and how to approach people through that role. If someone's not in that role yet, but would like to develop that skill set, is there anything you'd recommend to start practicing? Does that spark the thought?
That's what I was going to say. If you are interested in policy, if you are early in your career and you want to know how you do it, learn how policy is put together, learn how to advocate, then go and volunteer with Results. It is the best organisation. Maybe there's 1 or 2 others that are pretty good, but it's so good because it takes people who are completely green and it absolutely shows you how to do it, how to write a letter, it gives you feedback, how to actually talk to an MP. It takes you to do that stuff and supports you as you do it. And it is a really useful thing to stick on your CV to say that you've been a volunteer, because while we love volunteers here and it's really valuable and it adds to your CV, we would add 3 gold stars to your CV. Results volunteering would add 10 gold stars, especially if you want to go into policy. So that answer the question.
No, absolutely. Thank you. And so, Michelle, what's your broad interaction with this topic?
Sure. Thank you, Jamie. Thank you, everyone, for being here. I was going to hold forth on my little spiel, but since Jamie was going to start by asking me how I got into this, I figured I would just preempt it by talking a little bit about how I got into it. So Chris has spoken about the grassroots end of things, and I have done, and in other areas of just personal interest, I continue to do these things. And as Chris said, you should do these things in development or elsewhere, because really you have no idea how powerful you are. And honestly, everyone should know who their MP is, how to meet with them about the political process, about the policy process. So there's that's worth doing. And I'm going to speak about the other end of things, which is influencing policy. But yeah, I will detour briefly into talking about how I got here. I'd always had an interest in politics, sort of broadly speaking, but I was never directly involved, which might sound kind of odd. And in hindsight, I'm actually really glad that I wasn't. I've seen a couple of friends go off and work for parliamentarians. They've scrubbed their social media. They've kind of gone invisible online, especially where they're women, especially given what we've seen in the last couple of years in and around Canberra. So I'm, in hindsight, kind of glad that I was sort of this knowledgeable person, but a bit of a political clean skin. I'd also had a long-standing but fairly unfocused interest in wanting to make the world better. That's kind of partly how I ended up in development. And I'm not sure why I'd never really brought all of these things together. You know, sort of the idea of politics, making things better, development, advocacy, and the political involvement seems like a kind of obvious conclusion, but it took me a while to get there. I've certainly done, as mentioned, some other sorts of advocacy as well, particularly in the environmental space, and I continue to do that. When I was at uni, I had a PhD supervisor who was very strongly engaged in advocacy and tobacco control. He was an expert in that, he was very, very well known for it, but I just hadn't really done any policy or political advocacy myself until I ended up at Results. And in fact, the woman who hired me there, with whom I'm still terrific friends, we have a great relationship, said to me later that she certainly didn't think she was looking for me when she hired me. I'd just come out of academia. I thought slowly, I wrote slowly. She was a bit of a bull at the gate. She wanted to do everything yesterday. It turns out that both sets of skills can be quite useful for different sorts of things. So as I said, I will talk about the policy advocacy and policy influencing side, which is what I've been more involved with. So what do I mean by that? You know, policy might sound a bit, and I should say I don't assume I'm speaking to people who know nothing of what I'm talking about. I'm sure I know there are some people who know at least a little about the things I'm speaking about here, and people online who do. I haven't met everyone yet, so I can't speak to all of you, so I hope there won't be too much repetition with things that people already know. But policy might sound abstract, but it's kind of embedded in our lives and embedded in the work we do, and it shapes sort of the parameters of what's possible, sort of the decisions we're able to make, what we're trying to do as we do our work to try and make the world better. And policy advocacy could be any number of things. It's going and meeting with MPs or advisors, sharing ideas with them. It's socialising policy with other advocates. It's giving input into formal policies. It's making the case over change for over time with public servants. And there are a lot of layers and steps in the policy process. So, you know, depending on what it is we're talking about, there are sort of timelines. For instance, it could be you're interested in the Australian aid budget. Well, that happens every year. There might be some work you're doing around getting Australia to commit to funding one of the large global multilaterals. They come up every 3 to 5 years. Or, for instance, last year we saw the new Australian aid policy. They probably only come up every 5 to 10 years. So there's different timelines. There's also a range of people and organisations involved. So there's other players in the sector, there's government departments, there's international bodies. It's always a little bit different depending on the area, but as Jamie mentioned, a lot of my advocacy work's been around tuberculosis, or we generally call it TB for short because it's always easier. Most of my examples are health related because that's just what I can speak to, but of course there are any number of fields and areas of interest where you can engage in policy advocacy, both inside your work in the sector and outside. So I just want to sort of make a couple of really general kind of observations. Then of course, as Jamie was saying, we'll take questions, and I've got, if I can squeeze it in, hopefully a little example to sort of make really concrete the sort of thing I'm talking about. So in the case of a specific piece of policy or a document or a decision, you want to know what and who and when. So what issue or what process are we talking about? Do we want to influence legislation? Are we trying to influence government spending? Or are we looking actually for something a little bit more abstract, like a change in language? So in the last couple of years, there's been a lot of work to try and change the way that we speak globally about people affected by TB. That's standing on the shoulders of work in the last 30 years or so to change the way we talked about people with HIV. Some people here, fortunately, are young enough not to remember some of the ways we used to speak about people with HIV, which if I told you now what they were, you'd say, oh, really? You would have said that? Because now that's not the kind of thing we say. Back then, totally fine. You would have seen the same thing in Australia, the way we speak about people with a disability, the way we speak about Indigenous people. And a lot of that has been a really slow sort of social process of advocacy to say, yeah, we don't say those things anymore. So we also need to know who we're trying to reach. And that's often decision makers. It might be parliamentarians, a head of state, senior officials, but sometimes it's the people who can reach them. We can't always get to the head of state, but we can get to the media, their constituents, an advisor or someone else that they really listen to. And we need to think about, how to reach both those types of people and keep in mind that we might not be the best messengers. So we also need to build relationships. And I'm going to say a little bit about that, a little more about that later. And also want to consider how to communicate with these people. A bit like Chris was saying, they're not going to have time to read a report. You want to put together something short and snappy with a clear message, not too much technical language, or you might actually want to do something else that you think might get their attention, like a presentation or a side event at a big conference that they're going to be at. From memory, the kind of briefs that results would put together, as Chris said, it was always, well, actually it was one sheet, it was always two sides because you never waste space, but it was pretty much always the situation. So I'm going to give you some background, some figures, the scale of this thing, why it matters. I'll talk about the problem, so why it's an issue, why you need to care about it, and then of course, because I'm an advocate, I'll talk about the solution. So yeah, I've told you this problem and how big it is. Here's what we think we can do about it. What specifically you, the government, your organisation, whatever, can do about it. I'll send it to them before the meeting in soft copy, and then I'll bring them a copy and leave it behind afterwards. And at the best meetings, bless them, the advisor's sitting there with the hard copy in front of them, and then you're going, yes. And in this communication, as I sort of suggested, we want to offer something productive because a policymaker needs constructive ideas. So you want to communicate options in a way that feels technically feasible, but is also kind of politically palatable as well. And these kind of new ideas can help to improve policy or ensure that it helps the greatest number of people or that it doesn't fail in ways that we haven't anticipated. And even when you're talking to parliamentarians or to advisors, they also, sometimes they want to hear stories. Advocates often go and tell stories, hi, Mr. MP, this is why I care about this issue. Well, senior advisors and ministers often want to hear stories as well as facts and figures. So sometimes you take someone along who can speak to an experience. Sometimes you'll tell them a story yourself. And in terms of the who, for some policymakers, your audience, for some policy advocacy, your audience isn't decision makers. If I get time to do this example, I'll talk a little bit more about that at the end. And finally, the when. So both in terms of, all right, is there a decision that's being made? When's that happening? Is it before the budget? Is it at the end of this consultation period? Is it at that meeting that's on next week? And there might also be some strategic moments we could grab attention or be able to reach someone who's important. So some of these opportunities, they're known things. You know, we know when the deadline is, or we know when the meeting's coming up. And it's actually not a case of us really pushing to try and get in. Sometimes, you know, there's a new policy. Sometimes we get invited to contribute. So we should jump on that. If there's an invitation, you know, if the door's open, you should go in. But sometimes there are unexpected opportunities. So you need to be ready to take them. Maybe even be a bit creative and think about kind of what sort of attention you want to draw to your issue, how you want to do it, who you want to do it with. So a couple of the quick observations. We don't do policy change on our own. It's usually beyond the scope of any one organisation, and it's also a pretty complex process. So we're always working with other people, cooperating with colleagues, with allies, with other people who share our aims and our objectives. And as I mentioned earlier, we also want to build relationships. So with people who are likely to want to advocate, because this opens doors for us, it opens doors for our ideas. And by this, I don't mean that we're trying to be their friends. I mean, some of them are actually terrific people, which kind of helps, but we need to create trust, because you can't advocate to the person who won't reply to your email and the person who won't answer the phone when you ring. That's just, no advocacy is happening there. So you, especially if, say, they're a parliamentarian, you find out about them. Oh, that person's interested in such and such. Oh, that's interesting. When I go to see her, I can talk to her about that. Sometimes, again, with parliamentarians, you tickle their ego sometimes. You don't forget to thank them. Parliamentarians get an absolute shed load of criticism. Some of it's really well deserved. It's amazing, though, how well they react when they get thanked, because I don't think that happens nearly so often. And when I talk about building relationships, I'm definitely including in that building relationships with staffers. They're the gatekeepers to decision makers. They can certainly make sure that you don't get a meeting. I mean, except if it's your MP. Yeah, don't be nice to the staff. Well, sorry, no meeting for you. And the basis of results work, sort of thing Chris mentioned, we've got grassroots advocates going in and talking to MPs, that sort of very broad kind of relationship building, but also in a very deep sort of way too. When I go and talk to an advisor, another MP in an electorate where maybe we don't have someone, our approach was always what's called the model of the critical friend. So in public, we'll always talk really positively about a person because we want to be seen as good faith actors. But because we have a relationship, in private, we can say what we think of this idea that we've heard about this new policy, or perhaps some concept that's come up. They might even ask us what we think. And because we have that relationship and that trust, what we have to say is that little bit more likely to be heard and perhaps taken on board. So even though sometimes it possibly feels a bit daunting to really believe this, be it as a constituent or in the course of your work, you actually are an expert in your issue and you have something useful to say. That's not to say that you're the expert, but you've prepared for this, you know things on some issue or other. You're actually going to know more than the person you're going to go and meet with, possibly more than even some public servant who works on the issue. I know the founder of Results, Sam Daly-Harris, talks a lot about this. He says parliamentarians are there to serve us, their constituents. When we come to them and tell them about something that they don't know about, that's actually a really important part of the political process, to go to them and say, hey, there's this problem. It's kind of your job to help fix it. So we're actually playing a really important role in that in that process. Policy and policy advocacy are also not linear processes, and they are inherently political. So, for instance, in relation to TB, an issue I work on a lot, we're not necessarily lined up against some person who thinks, TB is great. I want everyone to have TB. I don't know what you're talking about, No, we're not lined up against a person who doesn't want action taken. We're lined up against a status quo. And a status quo always exists because it works for someone. So in the case of TB, a lot of the burden of illness is in low and middle income countries. There's this really long-standing perception that it's an illness of poor people, and it is going to require a huge investment to get the treatments and prevention that we need, that really work, and to get them to everyone. So if that situation stays as it is, there are huge financial savings to be made. Oh, and there's not that much TB in Australia, so we'll still be okay, right? So you can see that to go out and advocate that this action be taken, it's as much a case of values. Hey, I don't think that status quo is okay. That's a question of values as much as it's a case of going out and making an argument about, well, last year over 10 million people contracted TB and 60% of the world's burden of TB is in the Asia Pacific, so you should do something about it. It becomes, a question of both. It's values and it's about making a case. And on that note, we don't, sadly, go in a seamless kind of way from a problem to evidence to policy that makes inherent sense and includes all the things that we know it should. Policy change is complex and it has a lot of moving parts, but you understand the process and how it works. You can discern where best to intervene, and you also want to be in it for the long haul and be reasonably patient, depending on the issue and on the context. A lot of the time it feels like nothing's happening, and then, of course, as in the way of these things, then sometimes lots of things can happen at once. So you set some milestones, you remember to take the small wins when you get them, and keep up to date with the decision-making process. I might stop there because I feel like I've already gone over my time, but maybe there'll be a chance later to go through my little example. Thanks.
Thank you. Well, if nothing else, I am deeply curious about what the example is. Thank you for all of that. I'm still processing very cool things there. I guess one little question I had, and I don't know if anyone else had this, was with that sort of more community change and soft policy of something about like the language about TB usage. It's not a hard, change. Do you sort of take more of like a grassroots approach if it has to come from the community mindset to change that? Or is it like a hard top-down, like in a Disability Discrimination Act of you can't say this anymore? What sort of approaches have been taken there?
Well, if Chris wants to say something on that as well, she can. Language is an interesting one because you really can't legislate, can you? Honestly, there's some dreadful words out there that nobody uses anymore, but they're still not illegal. No, I think language change is a case of social change. That's always probably going to take the longest, and that would probably be a case of move on all fronts. You have groups of people affected by TB who say, we are people affected by and infected with TB. We are not TB cases, we're not patients. You start to communicate this to medical organisations, so you will no longer have doctors saying those things. You will suggest to the health department that a policy not be written in this particular way. You might have a language guide start to be developed that might go to the media. You've possibly noticed in the last 5 or 10 years, there are really good guidelines now about how we talk in the media about people who've taken their own lives. That's because there's really good guidance. I'm sure there's guidance in a lot of different countries, but there is some Australian-derived guidance that I think's actually served as guidance for other countries, but it's really well done. They talk about it in a particular way. They don't talk about how someone has done it. They'll always say at the end, if this story has raised any issues for you, you can call. You see an article on a website, we'll do the same thing. All these things are as a result of a language guide. And then often it's just, sometimes it's the one-on-one conversations, sometimes it's in a forum like this or in the media, you'll sort of be explaining, well, why would we talk like that? Well, here's why. you know, and making a case. And then I think people, once you reach a critical mass of people starting to use certain words, then you see them catching on more. I think government and politics and politicians will be part of that. But again, you can't legislate a word. It sort of starts to fall out of use. But that's usually because you've moved on all fronts and people have started to see that language is changing. But one good thing I think is, I think people are getting a little more thoughtful. You can sort of start to see words. You're like, I don't know, do we say, you know, I'm struggling to think of an example, but there's some words that I think maybe we're not talking about yet, but I know I've seen for myself and I've gone, do we say that anymore? I don't know if we do. You know, I think we started to become a little more self-critical of these things. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. That definitely answered some interesting things for me, and I hope that interested you guys as well. So if you've been holding on to any burning questions, now's your chance if we want to bounce out to the floor, if any of you have anything to ask. Yes, I will shuffle down if you'd like. Or... Thank you.
Thanks for that. I'm really happy to hear how results has evolved, because when I worked at WiAD, which was a while ago now, around 2001, they had a campaign on microcredit, and I was the person that was working for the department. And it's really, I mean, I knew the results people then, and it was really interesting to sort of see how worried people would get. And you know, while it was a small group, it really did cause a ripple and a lot of work inside the bureaucracy, inside WiAD. I have a question about the advocacy you do on health, and there are just so many issues out there, even within health, you know. How do you get traction? How do you get, you know, the attention of your, like, even, so for my local MP, I write to them on a number of issues, but if we want something taken up, I mean, she's already got a huge portfolio of things. So I'm curious to know how you would get your MP to take on an issue, particularly if I mean, I don't know what the specific ask is, but particularly if it involves a sort of budget ask. How do you get that sort of above all the other things? Because when I worked in the department, I was told when we had ministers that were visiting, they would say, if the local Medicare office closes, I'll get 100 people coming to my office, but I won't get a handful of people around the aid program. So that's my question. Thanks, Chris.
You should start with that one.
Okay, well, I won't answer it as well as others might, but you get it on the agenda by, well, first of all, there are quite a few organisations who work together, as you know. So the first key thing is trying to get it within the aid sector, the environment, and seeing which other organisations are going to be engaged in that. So for something like TB, there are some of the multinationals here. There are some of the other health organisations. There are a lot of the agencies who see people with this, who see people who are disabled by various things. So working together, getting some of the consortiums like the, what's the religious one called? I've forgotten. MICA, yeah, that, getting that group together. Or there are also parliamentary groups. So there's a parliamentary group or parliamentary caucus on TB. So they're all MPs who are interested, and they might be living in the area, like Warren Ench, who has TB coming into his electorate from people who live very close. Or it might be people who have a health background, like that MP who's a doctor. So you just got to keep reaching out through all of those different areas and try and get a consistent message through. Beyond that, I'm going to give it to Michelle.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, were you talking specifically about a health issue within the aid sector, or just a health issue, say, in general in Australia? Sure.
Yeah, so that was very helpful, Chris, just to know how you're collaborating with others, to just ask them the issues with you and explain context.
And we could ask Tarina, who's there today as well.
Yeah, sure.
You two have got it all covered.
Yeah, I was going to say somewhat similar things to what Chris has said. Find your people to work with because you're not going to do it on your own. Find the people to connect with, either the parliamentary friendship groups or you'll find, well, for instance, Warren Ench, who Chris mentioned, who's one of the co-chairs of the Australian TB caucus. His mother had TB when he was a child, so there were a couple of years he didn't see her because she was away. He remembers this, and now, as Chris said, because his electorate is way up in the point in the far north of Queensland, and the part of PNG that has one of the highest burdens of TB is basically one of the closest points in PNG to Australia. Sometimes when people can get across on a little boat, they will end up in Cairns Base Hospital. So people like that, you know, he was that side of the equation. He was the person interested who went, where do I find the people to help me with this? And we were looking for a parliamentarian, so that was kind of a match made in heaven. With some issues, there'll be a kind of a domestic side of the coin and also an international side of the coin. So I think people who are interested in HIV, the domestic and the international, tend to work together. But yeah, if it's an issue like TB, you need to find your people to be making the case, as Chris mentioned. So there's the Global Fund that already commits money for TB, HIV and malaria. So we're making results, and others are making a case for Australia to invest in that every 3 years. So it's just sort of this drip of kind of reminding people that you're there. Having an ask, something like the Global Fund, is great because you're making a really specific ask for a specific amount of money. Oh, sure. What else? Yeah, often it's sadly about making a case for why something matters to Australia. So it's easy to make that case for TB because 60% of the global burden is in the Indo-Pacific region. So, you know, when you can say something is kind of on our doorstep, that helps. And at the moment, now that we have this language, we should pick it up and run with it. That makes TB basically a health security issue. And as soon as you can use those words, certain people start paying more attention. You know, one of the reasons the Australian military has long been interested in malaria is because they're really aware that their troops could end up in Northern Australia or off the coast and get malaria, and they don't want that. So they've invested quite a lot in treatments and clinical trials for that very reason. But I would say, yeah, you have to find your people, be able to make a case for why something matters, and then kind of dig in for the long term and keep making the case. And it does take a long time, but the great thing about something being on an agenda is you have to keep it there. But once it's on an agenda, no one goes, oh, hang on, we didn't used to talk about that and now we do. People's memories are often quite short. They just assume it's always been on the agenda, so you then just have to keep it there.
Well, thank you. That was an excellent question and a very interesting answer. We might just jump to online from Jacinta. Do you see that you have used these advocacy skills, I assume, in other areas of your life and career?
I certainly have in quite a bit of my career, but a very local one recently was I saw one of our local, in the sort of village I live in Greenwich, there was a note that said there's a lot of pollution in the local creek. I went, oh, that's absolutely outrageous. So I wrote to my local councillor and said, you know, what's going on? There's a huge building site and clearly they're letting all that pollution go. As a constituent, I could be quite, you know, excited about it. And she came back to me and said, I didn't know about this. So gave some photographs and she said, I will do what I can to raise it with the council. And why don't you go and talk to the North Sydney Council, which is on the other side of the creek? They both have responsibility. So I did that, and I had one of their councillors call me and say, this is terrible. And then I had one of the people from council and one of the executives say, oh no, there's nothing wrong with that. You know, that building site's fabulous and they're doing all the right things. So I wrote back to their councillor, and about 2 days later, there was a whole lot of Sydney Water people there. And I had a note to say, oh, very unusually, there was a problem with the sewer. It had cracked. Anyway, what it turned out was that this huge building site had been letting all that crap go into the creek. They didn't have the proper environmental stuff, but because I was a bit of a squeaky wheel, they now have all those bougies and they have people sweeping. The creek is clean again, and hopefully will remain that way for the next, 5 years that they're building. But that's just a really local example. But that's, you know, in my life, I try and get people to just write a letter. One letter can be so powerful, because one of the things you learn at Results is when you write those online petitions, you know, when somebody put your name here and send it off, a petition of 50,000 does not have as much impact as one letter written to an MP or an email these days, of course. Few people know how to actually write on paper anymore. Not that they know how to read anymore. But I do, don't I? I'm holding up Australia Post myself with all the postcards and birthday cards I send. But seriously, one letter has much more impact, absolutely, than anything, than lots of, you know, tick and flicks, basically.
Okay, thank you for that. Because, you know, fantastic to know that it's, you know, a career benefit and, you know, making an impact in the world in everything you do throughout, you know, the career, but also in your personal life. You can make a little difference in something that matters to you. Do we have any other questions from the floor at the moment? Yes, we did have one more come through. So how much of a time commitment is volunteering with Results, and do you have to be in Sydney? I'm not sure if you want to speak to it generally now or make a connection later.
Maybe.
Thank you for that. So I'll start with the last in mind. So Sydney, no. We have 4 staff in Melbourne, our CEO in South Australia, board in Sydney, and a staff member also in Sydney. So you certainly don't have to be based in Sydney. Time commitment, currently what we have with volunteers is we have a fellowship program which goes for a longer period of time, or you can be part of one of our call to actions, so one of our advocacy programs that we're doing. So whoever is interested, please reach out to myself. I'm part of Women in Aid and Development as a board member. I'd also be happy to introduce you to whichever state you're in, just to have a chat about, is it something that you'd like to consider? But yes, please reach out. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. So that was Tarina, who's with Results Australia, and we can pass on some of those contact details and connections later. So thank you very much for that. I guess we've got 1 or 2 more minutes. Another question? Fabulous.
Great. Thank you so much, both of you, for sharing your personal experiences and sort of evolving that into, you know, broader than your own personal experience as well, like the experience of Results, but also the whole kind of advocacy sector and community, you know. So thank you for that. I'm interested in, you know, how long this stuff takes, right? And it can take an age. So, you know, often we hear people who've been advocating for these issues in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s and the noughties saying, are we still talking about this stuff today, you know? So what I want to understand is how you've seen real impact in keeping the issue fresh. Like, how do you raise a different angle a different idea? How do you make it relevant in a new way? Like, it's great that it's on the agenda, but so what? You know, so how do we keep making that relevance?
Why don't I start and say, some things do happen. So, for example, again, using results, and you mentioned they started off in microfinance. Yep, Results was right there at the beginning. Results was the organisation that got Mohammed Yunus to actually be involved and start Grameen Bank. They worked at a grassroots level for a very long time, right around the world. And microfinance moved into a broad, well, it's the world over now, small loans run by so many organisations that people work in, changing the lives of so many people to the point that's why Results doesn't work on microfinance anymore, because it moved from being a one organisation issue to being a multi-organisation issue and a world-changing issue.
That's a great example. The one I was going to give was health related because I'm a one-trick pony. I mean, I think it's great that you can see easily for yourself that issues have shifted because we just don't talk about them in the same way anymore. So, you know, we're now talking about, hey, let's get COVID vaccines to everyone because we already have them. And by the way, some of the advances brought about by COVID are hopefully going to get us a new TB vaccine, which we haven't had one of in 100 years. And so increasingly a lot of, say, global health advocacy, yeah, some of it is going, come on, why are we using the same vaccine for this after 100 years? We can do better than this. But a lot of it is now underpinned by talking about stuff that I don't think would have been part of the conversation 10 or 20 years ago, which is so much of global health now is talking about supply chains. Hey, we have the thing. Well, let's get it to the country. And then when it gets to the country, it can't sit in the warehouse in the capital city. It has to get to the clinic. How do we get it to the clinic? Also, we need to make sure that when it's in the warehouse in the capital city, we don't find out 5 years later that it's all past its use by date. So we start talking about things, you know, we definitely still want new treatments for this or a better vaccine for that. But a lot of it now is, there are just a lot of conversations now about health systems. How do we make them stronger? How do we make sure things that you and I take for granted, that if I ended up in Burke and needed a vaccine, I'd know it was probably there, that I'd know where to go to get it, that the nurse who's going to give it to me is trained to do that, that it's going to be in date. So things have definitely moved on. You know, it's only 30 years ago we were like, can we please have a halfway decent treatment for HIV so people don't just, you know, so the one treatment we've got, basically people wonder whether they'd be better off just not taking it because it's so awful that they feel like they'd rather just die. You know, now we have heaps of treatments. They're all really good. How do we get them to people? So you can, that's why it's really good sometimes to talk about small wins, because sometimes you can go, yeah, am I still talking about TB or am I still talking about this issue? Well, yeah, we are, but we're now, thank goodness, we get to talk about it in different ways. But, you know, if it weren't that issue, it'd probably be something else, because underpinning a lot of this is we're still talking about inequalities. And they just sprout up in different ways. You know, COVID came along and suddenly we were talking about how I could get a vaccine, but someone in Bangladesh couldn't. So.
I think one of the other things to remember is that sometimes it's the quantum of what we're talking about has changed. So when we're looking at the number of children who die under the age of 5, current terrible wars aside, that number was going down dramatically and has gone down over the years because of vaccinations, because of what Michelle says, better supply chains. So there is an impact, and that's one of the things that can really be quite impactful on the people you're talking to and advocating to?
Okay, thank you. That was a fantastic question. And yeah, it seems so important to keep changing things with the times and making things relevant and pointing out why they matter. So are there any more burning questions we've got going on? I think my one is just checking in. Do you still want to give that example? I'm still very curious. Or would you like to discuss on the floor? Okay, yeah. Would you like this one?
No. Okay, this is my concrete example. I mean, I hope I have, or we both have given some concrete examples, but this is a really concrete example. Okay, so I didn't talk much about my international work. So here's a concrete example from the international side. So as Jamie mentioned in the introduction, I spent some time working in the office for the Stop TB Partnership in Geneva. I still do some work for them remotely. They're a small UN agency housed under UN Ops that basically, as the name suggests, a partnership, 2,000 odd organisations around the world that work in some way in TB. Advocacy, patient organisations, medical organisations, you name it, all kinds of organisations, doesn't matter, they're all included under the partnership. And the partnership's kind of driving goal is to work toward ending TB. The technical side, the drawing up the guidelines on what treatments we should use and how we should use them, that's WHO, of course, because this is UN, so there's things in 5 places, because that's just the way things work. Anyway, so that's what Stop TB does. And you probably saw it a couple of weeks ago on the news. Every year in September, there's the UN General Assembly in New York. Great big set piece series of events for 2 weeks. You'll see people standing up in the Assembly Chamber, the General Assembly Chamber, and making their set piece speeches. There's a whole lot of big meetings because every country is there. Sometimes for part of it, heads of state. The rest of the time, it's delegations that are in New York, talking about this, talking about that. As part of that, there's a set of meetings that I know about, the ones in health. There are ones in other areas as well, but again, big set piece things called high-level meetings. In 2018, there was one on TB. It was the first time there'd been one. These high-level meetings are about really, really big, important issues that all countries should discuss and decide, yeah, we need to do something about that and to actually do the thing. And so at one of these big set piece high-level meetings, as part of the General Assembly, which is this 2-week thing in September, we have this declaration that gets produced that all countries have agreed to, and then you've got 5 years till the next one, because these meetings are every 5 years. In those 5 years, we go out, and the idea is we're going to do the things that we've agreed to. So, of course, as you can imagine, countries don't turn up on the day and look at these things and discuss them. The discussions have been going on for months. I didn't work on much of that process. The 5 years later, last year, the second high-level meeting, I worked on that. The discussions on that declaration went on for about 6 months. It was, as I said, delegations of countries in New York were discussing it, but civil society, Stop TB, other organisations were feeding into that because, again, your delegations aren't experts. They often turn to experts and say, yeah, tell me my opinion on this, basically, because they don't know. So out of the high-level meeting comes this thing, the political declaration. About 10 pages long, 53 fairly dense paragraphs. As I said, the thing that takes 6 months to negotiate. And it begins, we, heads of state and government and representatives of states and governments assembled at the United Nations in New York on 26th of September 2018 with a dedicated focus for the first time on the global tuberculosis epidemic, blah, blah, blah. Okay. So heads of state and government have just agreed to that. Right. And it's got all these facts, and we're going to do this, we're going to get treatment to this many people, we're going to make sure that we spend this much money on R&D. That's fantastic. Because like anything in life, if someone said they're going to do something, they sign to the thing, you're going to go back and ask them whether they've done it, right? And you've got 5 years to do that. So this is great. And we got as many figures in there as possible. So it's not just, oh yeah, we should definitely get more treatments to more people. Well, great. If you give someone nothing to aim at, they'll definitely hit it because you haven't given them anything to actually aim at. I mean, this declaration's available in the 6 official UN languages, which is great, but we've got a patient advocacy organisation in Peru. or an organisation of health workers in India, probably not going to sit down and read this. So we got out of the high-level meeting and went, this is great, this is so good, we know we can use this to really drive things forward, hold governments to account. But our partners, those 2,000 partners, most of which are really small, they're not going to read this. So what are we going to do? So we got this. This is good. This is the policy advocacy side of it. We need to translate this. We need to socialise it with our partners. So we sat down, drew out, as I said, all those numbers, because they're awesome numbers in there, produced this little booklet. It's 8 pages, not very dense text, colour. First 2 pages, we pulled out the numbers. So, oh yeah, we're going to get treatment to this many people. We're going to treat this many children with TB. We're going to commit this much to R&D. And then over here, not so much figures, but things that we thought were really important. So the declaration had really talked at a high level for the first time about stigma. And stigma is really important because it stops people going for treatment. They don't want to admit they've got it. They possibly know they've got it and they don't want to even think about the fact they've got it. So they're definitely not going for treatment because they're busy denying that they've even got TB. In the meantime, possibly giving their family a chance to get TB from them because TB is a family illness. Catch it from people around you. So we talked about the fact that the declaration had mentioned stigma. We talked about the fact that it discussed how we were going to hold countries accountable for these things that they'd said they were going to do. Next page. As I said, we spent 6 months negotiating this declaration. We weren't the only ones involved, but we brought in a lot of voices who would have struggled to get to their country delegation or to get their voice heard otherwise. So these 2 pages, they're about the 5 big asks that the TB community had made. And what we've done under each one is to list the paragraphs in the declaration where the wording in our asks had ended up reflected in the declaration. So it was a way of saying to communities, hey, you know, all those surveys you filled in and all those consultations you came to and that thing that you wrote for us, here's what that got us. It's actually in the declaration. So now you can go out and talk to your health minister. When you meet with your TB program director, remind them that this is in there, because then there'll be a breakdown of, oh, we said we'll treat 40 million people globally. Okay, Stop TB did a breakdown. That's going to mean in Brazil this many additional people. So I can go to say to my health minister, well, we need to treat this many more people between now and 2023. How are we going to do that? Blank page there because English doesn't take as much space as some other languages. And then, because you never waste space, if I go and meet with my health minister, I've said it's time to play my part to achieve the targets in the UN political declaration. I can get them to sign it. And while I'm at the meeting with them, I get the photo, I'm standing beside them, they've signed it, they're holding it up, and then I put that photo on social media and say, I met with the minister, look, they signed it, how good is that? Yeah, the minister loves the declaration, the minister's definitely on board and they're doing the thing. The booklet's in the other 5 UN languages as well, so every time my colleagues in the office are going to a meeting, they're coming to me and saying, I need some of these booklets. We ran out of all the Russian booklets because one of my colleagues was just really keen on them. Every time he went to a meeting, he's grabbing a stack of them. We had to get them reprinted. So they're going off in all the languages. They're going to countries. They're getting socialised. So the country partners, the minister, whoever, doesn't make, oh, hopefully the minister reads this. The partner might not read this, but they've read that, so they know what's in here. And then they're saying to the minister, hey, we need to do this thing. We want to work with you to do this thing. How are we going to do this thing? And then stuff's actually happening. So 5 years later, the declaration from last year, we haven't got all the places we want to get, but we got a fair way because there were things to aim at. All the countries had agreed to it. So we weren't asking them for anything they hadn't already said they were going to do. And then people in country who are better placed than me are in their meeting with the person who's got power or the money or the resources to do the thing, is doing it, and they know that that person's going to be holding them accountable. So that's my example. Thanks.
Well, thank you so much for that. I think that was definitely worth it to wrap up tonight, of seeing something in action, of how do you take it from advocacy and going to government and talking to these organizations to something that really works in policy and in practice. So that was fantastic. Thank you. So it has been a fantastic evening. I've definitely learned a lot, and I hope you guys have too. But unfortunately, it's about time that we wrap up. So please join me in thanking Chris and Michelle for their time and their insights. I'd also like to thank the rest of the Women in Aid and Development Leadership Group and Event Committee who supported the smooth running of tonight's event and its planning, and an extra thank you to Chris as our chair, who brings us all together. Tonight, we'd also like to make an extra special thank you to Michelle. You knew this was coming. For those of you who may not know, Michelle is soon going to be taking her wonderful self off to the UK for the next phase of her career adventure. So while we're incredibly excited for you, we're also going to miss you terribly. So I'll just pass over to Chris to give a special thank you for being such an enormous part of Women in Aid and Development.
Yeah, thank you, Michelle. We absolutely will miss you. You've been around most of the time that we've been existing, always coming to events, been a fantastic Sydney leader and facilitator. Really appreciate your knowledge of the sector, the fact that on the event committee, you always come up with at least one and quite often 6 suggestions of speakers, some of them quite left field, but always useful for the next or the next event. Really appreciate your passion for the careers of women in the sector. Really appreciate that you're probably our most frequent return speaker because you know so much in so many areas. And it's just a huge wrench for you to leave to go to the UK. But I'm comforted by the fact that you've been away a couple of times and come back because you love us. So I'm hopeful of that. I don't have any fancy gifts for you. I know you've already got our Women in Development mugs, and we don't have much else. 2 mugs. There you go. But thank you, a heartfelt thank you. And I can see Natasha is also saying, wishing you the best, and you'll be sincerely missed. We really will keep in touch because you know everyone, and I will be asking you for speaker suggestions, even if you are enjoying sunny or cold England. Thank you. Truly, thank you. And can I also say, welcome to Jamie Lee, who is our new Sydney leader, who's done a fabulous job tonight as facilitator, very well organised. And thank you because you've been around also for the last year, if not more. You've taken on a couple of different volunteering roles, and congratulations on getting your first gig in the sector this week. And so that's great. And I just want to say, join Women in Development, do some volunteering, and you'll find yourself a job. I'm taking all of the, we're taking all of the credit. So thank you.
Rightfully so. It did help. Okay, so thank you for that, and thank you again, Michelle. So I do genuinely hope that as we finish networking tonight, all of you do have a chance to chat to Michelle before she goes. She is genuinely wonderful, so please have a chat to her. So that brings us to the end of the discussion portion of our event. Please stay in touch and connect with us online, either through the website, the Facebook, or the LinkedIn. I highly recommend as well that you also join the mailing list to stay updated on events and opportunities. And if you'd like to, you can become a Women in Aid and Development member, which will assist us financially, as well as giving you the opportunity to participate in the mentoring program. So obviously people are at different stages of careers. If you're just starting, you can be mentored. If you've got a wealth of experience to share, then you can be a mentor, and it's beneficial for everyone involved. So this is our last event of the year. Our next event will be in March 2025 in line with International Women's Day. So it'll be a fantastic way to kick off the first quarter of next year, and we'd love to see you all there. So finding out the details is another reason to join the mailing list. But for now, that's the end of tonight's session. So thank you to the Canvas Space and Raphael on the door and all of you for being here. Oh, it's squeaking so loudly. And thank you to our friends online. We'll pass on those contact details in a second. And please hang around for a little longer to speak to us. So thank you for being here.
Thank you. Can I just finally add, the We have 2 sheets over there at the back. Would love you to write down on the little slip of paper and just stick it onto the appropriate one with your name. Any topics that you would like us to present. The other one is for key takeaways, and we really want to know what you thought, and we may come back to you and say, can you expand a little bit, because we'd love to feature you on our Women in Aid Wednesday social media posts, which I have to say are the biggest popular piece on our social media, and we only need a few words, and we'll help you craft it if you need help. But that plus, if you'd like to be a volunteer, we're volunteer run. We run on the smell of an oily rag. And if you've got 2 hours a month and you're not quite sure what to do, we can find you something. Thank you for coming. Bye, everyone online. Thank you very much. Bye. Good night. Bye.